Some men die quietly while still breathing. And for 13 long years, Silas Boone had done just that. A living shadow riding between wind and dust, carving a life out of silence and sorrow on a ranch that heard no laughter, saw no light after sundown. He'd once held a woman's hand beneath the cottonwood tree, and listened as she dreamed of a garden full of wildflowers and children's feet. But death came early, snatching her and the baby she carried, before her garden ever bloomed. Since that day, Silas locked the world out. No visitors, no warmth, no God, just cattle, rusted gates, and a house full of ghosts. But fate has strange ways, and all it took was one mistake at a dusty auction to give him the thing he thought he'd buried forever: a family. The sun burned low over Dawson County the morning Silas Boone rode into town. His hat brim shadowed tired eyes, and his boots scuffed across the same boards he'd walked 100 times before. He wasn't a man built for crowds, but the old plow he needed wasn't going to fix itself. Auctions were the devil's business, noisy and full of folks pretending not to see him. That suited him fine. He stood quietly near the edge of the pens, eyeing the line of farm tools up for bidding. Lot 37. Rusted iron teeth, cracked handles, nothing fancy, but it would do. As the auctioneer backed numbers and gestures flew, Silas raised one finger slow and steady. That was all it took. Or so he thought. He heard his name called, not once, but twice. Then someone slapped him on the back. "Didn't peg you for a charitable man, Boone," a rancher laughed. Silas narrowed his eyes. "What?" he said, voice rough as uncut timber. "You got the whole lot. Widow and her young uns, too. Lot 38. You signed for it." Silas turned slow, confusion flickering like a wick just lit. A woman stood behind a post, thin, sunburned, carrying a toddler on her hip. 4 children in total. Eyes wide, clothes dusty but mended with care. "I didn't bid on no family," Silas muttered. The auction clerk looked down at the paper. "You lifted your hand as we transitioned lots. Your name's down. She's yours until reassignment. State law. 90 days minimum." The widow spoke then, soft but steady. "We'll be gone in the morning, sir. Just let us sleep on the porch." Silas looked at the kids. The youngest girl clung to her mother's skirts, big brown eyes blinking up at him, like he was thunder on the horizon. The oldest boy met his gaze without flinching, protective, already a man too young. The two in between, a 7-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl, stood close together, not saying a word. He looked away. "One night." That was all he said. He rode home slow with them behind in a borrowed wagon. The sky stretched wide and quiet as a prayer no one says out loud. At the ranch, he lit the lantern and handed the woman a wool blanket. The youngest kept staring at his boots. He didn't speak again that night, just poured a glass of water and pointed to the corner of the house where they could sleep. They whispered among themselves. He heard none of it. But the next morning, the girl asked, "Mister, do you have something we could use for frying?" He grunted, opened a drawer, handed her a pan. By noon, they'd swept the porch without being told. The little one kept following him around, giggling at the sound his boots made in the dirt. He didn't smile, but he didn't stop her either. He heard them talking that night around the stove. The older boy said he could fix the fence. The 11-year-old asked if they could plant something near the front steps. The woman, he hadn't asked her name, told them to be grateful, to pray, that the man had a kind soul, even if he kept it hidden like silver under dirt. That night, Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to soft voices and the creak of floorboards that had been silent for too long. On the 4th day, he left a bowl of stew beside the door before heading out to mend the windmill. When he came back, the floor had been swept, his laundry hung, and the toddler had placed a dandelion in his empty boot. He didn't speak, but he set her broken doll aside quietly and stitched the seam where the head had come loose, left it on the windowsill. The mother saw it and looked at him long. She didn't thank him aloud. She just nodded once, with eyes that had seen both grief and grace. By the 10th day, the youngest, now calling herself Emmy, began waddling to his chair in the evening. She'd sit beside him, jabber about things he didn't always understand. He nodded. Sometimes, she'd pull at his shirt or reach for his hat. He let her. One evening, she climbed onto the arm of his chair and placed her small hand in his beard. "You's like Papa," she said. Silas froze. The others stared from across the room, breath held like a stopped clock. But Silas didn't move her hand. Instead, he lowered his head and closed his eyes. Later that night, he pulled a wooden box from beneath the floorboards, a box with a faded bonnet and a folded note inside. It smelled like lavender, his wife's scent, the last she ever wore before dying giving birth to the child who didn't make it. He hadn't touched it in 13 years. The next morning, he set out a tiny pair of boots by the door, not new, but polished. When Emmy saw them, she squealed and hugged his knee. He didn't speak, but the edges of his eyes wrinkled with something long forgotten. That afternoon, he found the children and their mother in the back garden, the one overgrown with weeds and thistles. They were pulling out roots, clearing stones, raking soil with their bare hands. The sun cut through the clouds just enough to light the old oak tree where his wife once said, "Someday we'll sit here with our children, and I'll have my garden back, wildflowers and tomatoes and color everywhere. I just want a place where life feels soft again." Her voice echoed through his memory as he watched the children laughing, Emmy patting dirt into a clay pot, the oldest boy hauling water in an old tin can. And in that moment, something inside him cracked open. His wife's words weren't just memory now. They were happening, right in front of him. He wiped his eyes before anyone could see. The days settled like soft dust, slow but certain. Silas Boone said little, but his silence grew warmer, the kind that didn't shut doors but stood beside them, waiting. The children moved through the ranch like they belonged there, without asking. The older boy, Eli, began helping in the fields. He'd rise early, boots still too big, hands raw but willing. Silas watched from a distance as Eli struggled with the saddle one morning and stepped forward without a word, adjusting the strap just so. Eli glanced at him, unsure if he should thank him. But Silas only nodded, and the boy understood. Annie, the 11-year-old girl, had taken over the kitchen. She baked cornbread using a recipe from memory, even burnt the first few batches until Silas quietly left a tin of flour and a bottle of honey on the table. She lit up when she saw it, whispered, "Thank you," into the air, though he wasn't there to hear it. And Emmy, sweet, loud, unfiltered Emmy, had begun to take root in Silas's heart like clover through cracked stone. She followed him to the barn each day, holding her doll tight. She'd chatter endlessly, asking about cows, about clouds, about buttons missing from her coat. "Look," she said once, lifting a broken boot. "It got a boo-boo." Silas knelt down slow, took the boot in his hands, and said, "Let's fix it, then." His voice was gravel and warmth, and she beamed like the sun had heard her name. Then came the day his body failed him. It started with a cough, rough and dry. He ignored it, like a man ignores thunder he doesn't believe will rain. But by evening, his hands trembled. His back ached like the old injuries had returned with a vengeance. He didn't come down for supper, and when Eli knocked on the door, there was no answer. They found him fevered, breath shallow, skin flushed with heat. The widow, her name finally spoken, Clara, sat beside him with a cool cloth while Annie boiled water and Eli ran for supplies. It was Emmy, though, who curled up beside the bed and whispered, "Papa's sick." Clara looked down at her and nodded. "Yes, baby, but we'll take care of him." Emmy folded her hands together, squeezed her eyes shut tight, and began to pray. "Dear God, please fix Papa like he fixed my boot." The others knelt, too, Right there, beside the bed of a man they barely knew, but had already forgiven, already loved. For 2 days, the house changed. Annie swept every room. Eli chopped wood and kept the fire alive. Clara fed the chickens, cooked broth, and sat silently by the bed with a Bible folded shut in her lap. Not reading, just holding it. Not preaching, just hoping. On the third night, Silas stirred. His eyes fluttered open. The room was dark but warm. And there, beside him, Emmy had fallen asleep, with her hand resting on his chest. He looked down at her tiny fingers, then to the rocking chair, where Clara sat, half asleep, still watching over them all. He remembered something then. Not a moment, but a feeling. A soft garden. A child that never got to bloom. His wife's last words, her hand in his, whispering, "Grow something, Silas. Anything. Even if I don't get to see it." Tears welled in his eyes, uninvited but honest. He blinked them away. The next morning, the fever broke. Silas sat up, weak but alive. Clara helped him drink, her hands steady, eyes kind. "You gave us a scare." He cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said, voice like old pine breaking. Eli smiled. "No need to say sorry, Mr. Boone. We're just glad you're all right." That day, the garden was cleaned completely. The children planted rows of onions and daisies, and even found a tin of wildflower seeds in the barn. Annie organized the space, drew little signs with charcoal. Eli carried buckets of water from the creek. Silas watched from the porch, a blanket across his knees. "You've done more in a week than I have in years," he muttered to Clara. She sat beside him, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled. Sometimes it just takes a little warmth to wake up the soil. He looked at her, not with judgment, but with something like quiet thanks. Later that week, Emmy waddled into his room, dragging a wooden brush. "Brush hair, Papa." He chuckled softly. "Don't know if there's much left to brush." She climbed onto the chair beside his bed and began brushing what little hair he had, humming something only children understood. Then she leaned down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Don't be sick no more." "I'll try," he said, smiling without thinking. From that day on, she followed him like a shadow. She told him when her sock had a hole. She made him sit while she tied her shoelaces, wrong every time. She gave him a pebble she said was magic, and he kept it in his coat pocket. One afternoon, he took her hand and walked to the far field, where 2 small wooden crosses stood. One for his wife, one for the daughter who never drew a breath. Emmy didn't speak, just placed a tiny wildflower at the base of each cross and looked up at him. "Is that your girl?" He nodded. "She in heaven?" "I reckon so." Emmy squeezed his hand tighter. "Maybe she play with me up there sometimes." Silas couldn't answer. He knelt beside the grave, took off his hat, and let the wind carry whatever words he couldn't say. That evening, when they returned, Clara was waiting on the porch. "How was it?" she asked. "Peaceful," Silas said. "She left flowers." Clara smiled gently, her eyes filled with both sorrow and something warmer. "That little girl's got a heart bigger than the prairie." "She's yours," he said. "And now," Clara said, "she's yours too." Silas didn't speak, but he didn't need to. That night, he took out his late wife's shawl, the one she'd wrapped herself in the day they planted the first seed near the garden. He placed it over Clara's shoulders as she dozed in the rocking chair. She woke, startled. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said, softly. Then, almost like the world had paused to listen, he added, "You've all grown something, hey? Not just in the date." She turned to him, and for the first time, there were no walls left in his eyes. Only light. Only home. The ranch began to change. It wasn't loud. Not fast. Just steady, like the way spring creeps over frost, slow enough to miss unless you're paying attention. The laughter of children echoed off the barn walls. The table, once used for quiet meals alone, now had 5 sets of hands reaching for cornbread, passing spoons, folding napkins. Emmy spilled milk almost every morning, and every morning, Silas just handed her a cloth, never scolding, just handing it over like it was the price of joy. He started fixing things he'd ignored for years. The back gate creaked until he and Eli oiled the hinges together. The broken porch rail got replaced after Clara caught her dress on it. Annie suggested painting it white. "That's how Ma always liked it," she said, then corrected herself. "I mean, before." Clara looked at her gently. "It's still all right to say how Ma liked things." And Silas nodded. "We can paint it white." One morning, Silas found Clara standing in the old shed, running her hand over his late wife's piano. It hadn't been played in over a decade. Dust caked the keys, but her fingers knew where to go. She was teaching herself before she passed, he said, voice low. Clara didn't ask for permission. She just sat and played the first few notes of a hymn. The sound was cracked, the keys stiff, but it was music, fragile and holy in a way that made Silas stand in the doorway with his hat in his hand. Emmy danced to the music in bare feet, spinning like cotton in the wind. Eli leaned in the doorway, listening. Annie hummed along, and for the first time, the ranch felt like it had walls full of life, not just survival. That Sunday, Clara asked if she could take the children to church. Silas hesitated. "I won't ask you to come," she said, "but I'd like to thank the Lord for what we've found here." He nodded once. "You go ahead." He didn't follow them that week. Just watched the wagon pull away, dust rising behind them. But when they returned, Clara placed a folded paper on the table, a prayer the children had written. It read, "Thank you, God, for the roof over our heads, the warm fire, and the man who gave us both." Silas folded it, placed it in a drawer with his wife's letter, and didn't say a word. But he checked that drawer every night before bed. The children had turned the garden into something real now, onions already sprouting, tiny stems reaching for light. The daisies bloomed fast, as if racing to be the first to color the ground. And every evening, Silas would sit on the porch and watch them grow. One afternoon, Annie sat beside him. "Mama said people are like seeds. You just need the right soil, and something good'll grow." He looked at her. "She's right." She also said people can rot if no one checks on them. Silas's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "That's true too." She paused, then asked the question she'd been holding in for weeks. "Why were you alone so long?" He didn't answer at first. "Because it hurt," he said at last. "More than I could carry. So I didn't." Annie looked down at her lap. "We were alone too. After Papa died. Mama tried so hard to keep us all together. But then came the fire, and we lost everything. She never gave up, though." Silas glanced toward the field, where Clara was hanging clothes with Emmy clinging to her leg. "She didn't give up here either," he said. That night, Silas had a dream. His wife stood in the garden, holding a flower in one hand and a child in the other. She smiled at him, not as someone far away, but as if she'd been watching all along. He woke with tears in his eyes and went outside barefoot, standing under the same moon they once made promises under. The next morning, Clara found him in the kitchen, already boiling coffee. "Sleep all right?" she asked. "I dreamed of her," he said, "but it wasn't like before. I didn't wake up hurting." Clara smiled, warm and gentle. Maybe that's her way of saying it's okay to live again. They moved through the next few weeks like a family without labels. Eli asked Silas questions about cattle and tools, and even sat beside him while fixing the plow. Annie helped Clara with meals and read stories to Emmy when she fussed. And every evening, they prayed before supper. Silas didn't bow his head at first, didn't close his eyes, but he listened. And eventually, he joined. "Thank you," he said once. Just that. Into the space where prayer lives. And Clara squeezed his hand. Then came the day of the letter. The county clerk arrived unannounced, dusty and distracted, holding a folded document. You've got the option, he said, to reassign the dependents. And other families applied to take them in. Up to you. The children froze. Clara stared at the paper like it might bite her. Silas took it in silence. When? He asked. They could leave by week's end. He nodded once. Clara looked down. The children stared at him, hearts pounding. The clerk tipped his hat. We'll need your answer by Friday. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Emmy crawled into his lap without a word, clung to his shirt, and whispered, We go in, Papa. He kissed the top of her head. Not tonight. And in that moment, he knew. He sat by the fireplace until everyone else slept, then took out the paper, stared at it, and placed it in the fire without reading it again. In the morning, he saddled the horse, rode into town, and told the clerk, You asked if I want to transfer them. I don't. They are already home. It felt strange, how quickly things settled after the decision was made. No more silence around the dinner table. No more watching from the porch. Silas Boone was no longer a man on the edge of a family. He was in it. Fully, quietly, fiercely. He started waking the children himself. Not with words, but with biscuits already on the stove, coffee brewing, boots polished by the fire. Emmy was the only one he ever spoke to first thing. Come on, sleepy girl, he'd whisper, brushing her wild hair back. Sun's up. She'd open her eyes, smile without teeth, and throw her arms around his neck like he'd been her papa since birth. Eli now worked the ranch beside him like a second shadow. They built a new chicken coop together. Silas showed him how to patch the roof, fix the wagon wheel, reset a post. One day, Eli wiped sweat from his brow and said, You think I'm doing all right? Silas didn't look up from his work. Better than I did at your age. Eli beamed. Annie spent her afternoons teaching Emmy to write her name, and in the evenings, she'd sit beside Silas reading scripture aloud, not because he asked, but because she said it calmed her. Sometimes, he'd close his eyes and listen, letting the words settle deep like roots in dry ground. And Clara began to laugh again. It was soft at first, a sound tucked behind her palm when Emmy said something foolish or when the dog chased its tail into the well bucket. But Silas noticed. He noticed every time. He also noticed how she swept the floors humming now, how she sang to the bread dough, how she began placing a ribbon in her hair again. Nothing fancy, just something her late husband used to like. One night, they stood in the garden together, watching the moonlight touch the tips of the daisy petals. She would have liked this, he said. Your wife. He nodded. She used to say if she could grow something good out here, then maybe all the pain would have meant something. Clara was quiet for a while. Then, gently, I think it already does. Silas turned toward her, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the children playing by the fence, their laughter mixing with the soft wind. She raised good things, Clara said, even if they took time to bloom. And Silas knew, in the quiet of that moment, he wasn't just remembering the past anymore, he was building something new, with his own two hands. The town began to notice. The shopkeeper at Dawson General Store told everyone he'd seen Boone smiling while buying blue ribbons and cherry jam. The pastor said he saw the whole family sitting together in church one Sunday, and Silas even bowed his head during prayer. People whispered kindly now. One afternoon, the town blacksmith rode out to the ranch. Boone, he said, dismounting. Heard the girls been teaching your little one how to write. Thought she might like this. He handed Silas a tiny chalkboard, smooth and clean, with a box of colored chalk tied in ribbon. Silas looked at the gift, then at Emmy running barefoot in the yard. I appreciate it, he said. The blacksmith smiled. Never thought I'd see the day. Neither did Silas. Later that week, Clara found Silas sitting on the porch, oiling a locket. Inside was the faded picture of his wife, and beside it, now, a new photo. The one Clara had taken in town of all 5 children sitting on the fence, Emmy in the middle with jam on her cheeks. Clara sat beside him without speaking. They watched the sun settle behind the ridge. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I think so. First time in a long time." She hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think—" She paused, suddenly shy. "Do you think she'd be all right with this?" "Us." "The children." "Me." Silas didn't answer right away. He looked out at the garden, now full and green, and then up at the cottonwood tree where his wife once dreamed aloud. "I think she sent you," he said. Clara blinked, surprised. Her voice caught. "I'm not trying to replace her." "You're not," he said. "You're building what she never got to finish." There were no more words after that, just the sound of wind and heartbeats and chairs creaking beneath them. That night, the children gathered around the fireplace. Eli played with a homemade slingshot, Annie stitched a torn apron, and Emmy leaned into Silas's chest with her thumb in her mouth. He brushed her hair, gentle as rain. Annie looked up and said, "Mama used to say every house had its own soul, but it only woke up when it heard love again." Silas smiled. "Then I reckon this house is wide awake." The next morning, he rode into town and asked the pastor for something personal. A ring. Not new. Not expensive. Just something honest. The pastor raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure," he said. That Sunday, Clara stepped outside and saw something strange. Silas was wearing a clean shirt and had combed his hair. The children were lined up in their best clothes, and Emmy held a bouquet of wildflowers tied with string. Silas walked toward Clara, nerves and grace bundled up in his silence. "I don't know how to do this the right way," he said. "There's no right way," Clara replied, already tearing up. He took her hand. "I want to give them what I couldn't give her," he said. "A full home, a full heart, a full life." And right there, under the cottonwood tree, with the garden in bloom and the children watching with shining eyes, he asked her to stay. Not just as a guest, not just as a mother to the children, but as his wife. She nodded, crying now, and whispered, "I already have." And the ranch, for the first time in years, felt whole. They married beneath the cottonwood tree, the same tree where Silas once buried his dreams, and now stood to build new ones. There was no choir, no long procession, just the rustle of leaves, the smell of bread baking from the house, and 5 children standing in a line like the roots that held the ranch together. Clara wore a simple blue dress. Her hands trembled only once, when Silas took them in his, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Thank you for waking up the parts of me I thought were gone." She didn't cry, not then. But Emmy did, loudly and without reason, the way 3-year-olds do when their joy overflows. Eli gave her away. Annie carried the rings in a folded cloth. Emmy ran in circles and threw flower petals she'd collected herself, some of which were just twigs and weeds. But nobody corrected her. Not a soul. And when the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," it wasn't a kiss that marked the moment. It was the way Silas pulled Clara in with both arms like he was finally letting go of every ghost he'd ever carried. The town said later it was the first time they'd ever seen Silas Boone truly smile, and it never left his face again. The seasons passed. The ranch bloomed like it had waited all those years for something to believe in. Emmy grew taller, still full of stories and still calling Silas Papa, even when her voice grew clear and her feet stopped tripping over her own shadow. She loved ribbons and thunder and sitting on his lap even when she didn't fit anymore. And every year, on her birthday, Silas planted something new with her in the garden. "One for your heart," he'd say, "and one for the girl I once lost." Annie became a teacher, the first in Dawson Creek to open a one-room schoolhouse just off the ranch road. Silas built the benches himself. Clara painted the windows. Annie taught kids with her mother's gentleness and her new father's quiet strength. Eli grew into a man with hands like his father's, the one who died in that fire, and the one who taught him how to mend fences afterward. He took over the cattle with Silas beside him, and every Sunday, without fail, they sat side by side at church, boots dusted, hats in hand. The youngest boy, Tobias, once shy and always watching, became the heart of the home. He played music. He read late into the night. And when he laughed, it sounded like something that had been lost for generations, found again. And Clara turned the house into a home so full of life, even the ghosts seemed to soften. She hung pictures of all of them on the wall above the fireplace. She baked pies every Saturday, danced with Emmy while sweeping, and made Silas drink water when he refused to rest. One spring evening, years later, Silas sat in the garden, now a blooming wonderland of color and memory. Clara brought him tea, tucked a blanket over his legs, and sat beside him as the sun sank behind the ridge. "You remember what she said?" he asked, his voice a little thinner now. "Who?" "My first wife. She said, even if I don't get to see it, just grow something." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Well, you did. And then some." He looked out over the garden, over the fields, over the fence that Eli built, the schoolhouse Annie painted, the swing Tobias hung for Emmy, and whispered, "She would have loved this." "She does," Clara whispered back. There was no sadness in their silence, only thanks. The next day, Silas walked out with Emmy, now nearly a young lady, to the graves where his wife and baby daughter rested. He placed a fresh daisy on each, then turned to Emmy. "I used to come here to talk to them," he said. Emmy nodded. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I just come to say thank you." She took his hand, just like she did when she was 3, and they stood in the breeze, the garden dancing behind them. That night, as the stars came out one by one, Silas Boone sat on the porch, listening to the voices of his family inside, Clara humming, Annie laughing, Tobias telling a story, Eli stomping mud off his boots, and Emmy running from one room to the next, asking if anyone had seen her favorite book. And for the first time in 13 years, no, in a lifetime, Silas didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had been given everything back. But this time, in a form he never expected. Strangers had knocked on his door because of a clerical mistake. But it was no mistake at all. It was grace in rough clothes. It was God answering prayers the moment a man stopped asking. A lonely rancher, they once called him. But not anymore. Now, they called him father, husband, home. And that was the legacy Silas Boone left behind. Not the land, not the cattle, not the years of silence, but the love that grew out of it. The love that bloomed anyway.